And welcome back to Think Global Do Justice. My name is Brandon Stiver. Great to be with you guys once again. Hey guys, we have a fantastic conversation ahead with a trusted group. You guys are familiar with World Relief, and they've just been doing incredible work around the world, including here in the U.S., doing refugee resettlement. And excited to get into this conversation today with Matthew Soerens from their team. Before I do, want to give a shout out to our partners at the Accord Network. If you guys are not yet signed up for One Accord, do so. It is coming up later in the year, and it's the spot for anyone that is working in Christian humanitarian work. Please definitely join us for One Accord. And if you do sign up, use the code GLOBAL and get a discount. All right. I'm joined today by Matthew Soerens, who is the Vice President of Advocacy and Policy with World Relief. He is also the co-author of a few books, including Welcoming the Stranger and Inalienable. And he also serves as the National Coordinator for the Evangelical Immigration Table. So Matthew, calling in from Chicago. How's it going today, man?
It's going okay. Good to be with you, Brandon.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. You guys just released a report that caught my eye called Joined Together, Torn Apart, How U.S. Immigration Policies Are Separating Families. You guys released this alongside the National Association of Evangelicals. We're going to hop into that report, but a lot of people will be familiar with World Relief's work as well as your work in the policy space. Before we do, while we have had people from World Relief on, this is your first time, give us a quick little background just in terms of kind of how you got into your work with World Relief.
Sure. So World Relief has been around for about 80 years. Our mission is to boldly engage the world's greatest crises in partnership with the church. And I have been around, for about a quarter of that history. I started at World Relief 20 years ago. Actually, I started 21 years ago as an intern with World Relief in Central America. While I was finishing up my studies at Wheaton College, and really fell in love with the organization and with our mission, and then came back for my last semester at Wheaton, and there was a World Relief office down the street, and to be honest, I didn't really know what they did, but I knew I really loved what we did in Nicaragua, and so I applied for a job, and actually I think I applied for 2 or 3 jobs before I was hired, but I ended up in our Immigration Legal Services program at World Relief Chicagoland. Because as you said, World Relief works globally, but we also work in the United States, working with people from around the world who come as refugees or as other kinds of immigrants. So that was sort of my first staff role with World Relief, was working in immigration legal services. And I think this was, again, 2006, so quite a long time ago now. Even then, issues of immigration were pretty controversial, especially within the church and within Washington, and sort of policy questions as well. I would say refugee issues, which is a lot of the work that World Relief does, were less controversial at that time. That was sort of the part of immigration that everybody seemed to agree across partisan lines that, well, of course, the U.S. should take certain people fleeing persecution who've come in lawfully. But other immigration questions were complex at that time. So a lot of my work from pretty early on in my time at World Relief has focused on how do we help the church to think in theologically informed ways and missiologically informed ways about issues of immigration broadly, about the specifically thorny questions of what about immigrants who are not lawfully present in the country, and then also about questions of refugee resettlement. Is that something that should continue? What does that mean? And that is increasingly, it's always been, but I think that's increasingly a focus of our work globally at World Relief as well, because when we talk about the world's greatest crises, we've made a lot of progress as a world in issues like extreme poverty and some global health dynamics, and that progress needs to continue. While we've been making progress in those fronts, we've seen the number of forcibly displaced people around the world increase dramatically. It was about 60 million people who were forcibly displaced from their homes 10 years ago. When I started at World Relief in 2006, it was 25 million, and today It's at 120 million. So it's doubled and then doubled again, effectively. That is not just an issue for the United States, but it does have ramifications for the U.S. and then certainly for the rest of the world as well.
One of the touch points I've had with World Relief was when I was in grad school and we did our residency in Rwanda. I was living in next door Tanzania at the time, but getting to connect with some of the leaders that you guys had in Rwanda was really interesting. and you guys have fantastic programming overseas. Obviously, even as you were sharing and we talked about with Mile at your guys' 80th anniversary, he was talking about how some of the increase is related to certain countries and certain areas where it's just ramping up. So at such a scale that's driving the overall number much higher. That connection between what you guys do in other countries and then what you guys do in refugee resettlement, do you see some mitigation of forced displacement through your guys' programming in other countries? What does that link look like?
Yeah, we do. And I mean, it's very intentional for World Relief when we talk about, when we look at where do we operate internationally. I mean, we've been in more than 100 countries over the last 80 years, but we do our best when a country's in a stable place to leave programming with with local organizations, with the local church. Whereas we see our role as being in places that are much more fragile, where that outside help is needed. So, for example, right now we're in Sudan, which I would argue is the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world, without a lot of attention from American media in terms of displacement. I mean, it is amongst the top countries where people have been displaced both internally and then coming out as refugees to places like Chad, where we're also on the ground. South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, Ukraine. I think, Burundi as well in its own right, and then again also receiving refugees who've come over from the Democratic Republic of Congo and other contexts. So a lot of our work is in these contexts that also end up being the countries that we receive refugees from, or at least historically have received refugees from. And our hope, I mean, we want to receive people with an open welcome and then help them integrate when that's the best option for them. We also want to be working towards allowing them to flourish where they're at. And, our hope would be that refugee resettlement, we're always, going to be supportive of legal immigration, but we wouldn't want people to have to flee as refugees in the first place. That's like the last solution when it's just not safe to go home, often for many years. And so I think there's a lot of connections between the work that we do internationally and the work that we do in the United States, and it tends to be some of the same populations.
Yeah. Do you guys work in refugee camps, like that kind of liminal space in between communities overseas and then our communities here?
Yeah, in some cases we do. And refugees, I mean, sometimes they live in camp settings. We work in some of those, particularly in certain parts of Africa. Other contexts, refugees are basically living in urban contexts. They're not always in camp settings. And then we also have opportunities to serve people who are sort of in that journey as well. I mean, we work with partner churches in Mexico, for example, where you have asylum seekers who are coming up, or at least, again, some of this is in flux with some of the changes in policy, but have for a long time come up from either from southern Mexico or more often from Central America or Venezuela or, coming over from Cuba or Haiti and getting to Mexico and trying to come and seek asylum. So we are, in some ways, we're serving people at every part of that journey. I mean, we're in Haiti addressing the situations that are fueling so many people to leave and have fueled a lot of departure from Haiti over the last many years. We're also caring for people along that journey, and then we're also able to serve them when they land in communities like Seattle or Southern California or Chicagoland, where I live, or other parts of the United States. And all of that, wherever we can, is in partnership with the church, whatever the church looks like, whether that's along the border of Tijuana or in Haiti or in communities throughout the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the model. I love the getting behind the local church. It's reason why World Relief is one of our favorite organizations. I want to kind of look at this report that you guys just released. Guys, it will be in the show notes if you want to check out this release that World Relief did with the NAE, Joined Together, Torn Apart. Going into the current administration, there was a lot of consternation about what immigration policy might look like and what effect it might have. I actually, after the previous election, I sat down actually with Maynard and Gaeta from World Relief Western Washington and kind of got his views, both for him as somebody who did flee violence in Africa and came this way. And now we can look back at over a year of what that policy and practices look like, and perhaps in all the wrong ways, potentially, the policies and practices have kind of lived up to the expectation that maybe this wasn't going to be too great. We'll start super general, Matt. as someone who's really enmeshed in this work, how do you kind of reflect on the last year plus of immigration in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's been a really hard year and a half, and I think we anticipated some of that. I mean, I've been around World Relief for a long time. I've been around refugee resettlement and immigrant ministry for a long time. So in the first Trump administration, there were certain things that were very challenging. We saw really stark reductions to refugee resettlement, for example. But this time, we've seen even more stark reductions to refugee resettlement. And we've seen something that honestly we didn't really see in the first Trump administration, which was this push for mass deportation. And not just for people who have been convicted of violent crimes, which, to be clear, at World Relief, we don't object to that. If you've been, we want everyone to have due process, but if you murdered someone or something like that, we think if you ever get out of jail, you should probably be deported. But that's actually a very small share of the people who've been caught up in the immigration enforcement that's been happening. And that's not just my anecdotal observation. That's from data from the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, for at least the last data they released a month or so ago, more than 70% of the people that are detained have not been convicted of a crime. And even those who have been convicted of a crime, it's a very small share who've been convicted of a violent crime. Because speeding 20 miles over the speed limit, which I'm not confessing to and I'm recording, but that's a crime in the state of Illinois where I live. It's a misdemeanor offense. So there's people with very minor criminal offenses in that 30%, and then there's people with some serious criminal offenses. And if it was just about the people who've committed those serious criminal offenses, I don't think this would be controversial at all.
Of course.
The challenge is we have so many people who have not committed any crime at all, or at least not been convicted of any crime at all, including a very significant number of people who were lawfully present in the United States at the beginning of this administration. I think that is sometimes a dynamic that people miss. I mean, we've seen one group after another who had some sort of a temporary legal protection, like temporary protected status or something called humanitarian parole, that particularly because they've come from specific countries that have experienced humanitarian crises, like Haiti, like Venezuela, like Ukraine, like Afghanistan, and then they've had those protections withdrawn. So they were here lawfully, they were working lawfully, and then with basically the signing of a document, they were no longer lawfully present. That makes them vulnerable to being detained and eventually potentially deported. And that goes to this report, which, one of the questions we wanted to ask, and our partners at the National Association of Evangelicals have a keen interest in this as well, because of, I think it's sort of the reputation of evangelicals to be concerned about families, is what does this do in the many situations where you have mixed status families? Meaning, yes, you've got at least one person who the government could detain and deport because they're unlawfully present, or because they were lawfully present, but you could take that status away. But you've got at least one other family member, a spouse or a minor child, who's a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, and they can't be deported under the law. And of course, sometimes that's just a temporary separation where eventually the whole family will reunite in the deported family member's country of origin. But sometimes, look at a country like Haiti. Our government strongly advises U.S. citizens not to travel to Haiti. So if you are in a situation where mom just got deported to Haiti and dad is a U.S. citizen and the kids are U.S. citizens, should dad go to Haiti at this point in sort of defiance of guidance of the U.S. government? Or should they split up their family indefinitely? Or sometimes it's an even more stark situation where mom and dad got deported to Haiti. Kids are left behind. Are they going to go live with a family from their church or with an uncle or an aunt? Or in some cases, go into the foster care system? There's been a really significant increase in situations of foster care for children as a result of immigrant detention and deportation. And what we're not saying with this report is all detention and all deportation is wrong or inappropriate. Sure. We are asking the question, when is it necessary? Because it ought to be a last resort to split up a child from their mother and their father, to split up a marriage. If we believe, as Jesus says in the Gospels, that what God has joined together in marriage, man should not separate. I think there are circumstances, if you did commit murder, that is a situation where the state has a very compelling interest in separating that family, even if we feel badly for the spouse left behind and the children left behind, and actually have an obligation as a church to step into care as best we can. But those situations should be rather rare, and I think most Americans, and certainly most Christians, would rather see alternatives. Are there another way that we can penalize someone that overstayed a visa, or that crossed the border 20 years ago, or instead of taking away their legal status when they have been here lawfully, maybe just let them keep it and let them keep working and providing for their family and staying with their family.
Yeah, I'm reflecting. I was at a conference recently, the Care Portal conference in Kansas City, and was talking with a colleague of mine who oversees the market in Minneapolis. And that is obviously has been in the news this year for all sorts of reasons. And we were hearing, stories. He was sharing a story of a father who was detained and uh, was being sent back to somewhere in Latin America. I can't remember the country offhand, but essentially the ICE agent, the question was, well, what about, my family? Like, I've been working here, I've been providing for my family, I haven't committed any crimes, anything like that. And there was this very, from this particular agent, I'm not trying to like characterize all agents, but literally looked him in the face and said, your kids don't need you anymore. And what a sad reality to say like, oh yeah, that's justice. That makes sense. No, that's an awful thing. I mean, I'm in my 40s now. I probably still need my parents in certain regards, like what are some stories, just kind of, you guys have some great ones in the report, which again will be linked in the show notes, but what are some of those types of stories that you guys are coming across in all these different markets where World Relief is walking alongside refugees and immigrants?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the heartbreaking dynamic of the last several months is it's so many. I mean, it's too many to share, but just like a few. One we do share in the report is there's a number of churches in Midland, Texas, that have come together, particularly to care for U.S. citizen children of Venezuelan parents the parents have been deported, often very abruptly. And as most people know, Venezuela has been in a crisis for many years now, a mix of extreme poverty and also persecution in some cases from a very corrupt government, which, by the way, the U.S. doesn't recognize. We have a complicated history in the United States with Venezuela at this moment as well.
Yeah, didn't we just grab their leader or something? Aren't we
exactly.
pretty aware that there's stuff going on down there?
And that speaks to the tension. I mean, I don't know if we will reestablish diplomatic relations as a country with Venezuela, but when this particular situation occurred, moms were swept up and their children were left behind. And some of them were born in the United States. They don't have Venezuelan passports. And you can't travel to Venezuela without a Venezuelan passport, but there's not a Venezuelan consulate that can just like resolve this for you. So like we've had, there have been these situations where like members of local churches in rural West Texas are hosting children in their homes. In these cases, like most of the time, the moms actually want their kids back with them in Venezuela, but it's been several months. And it requires things like finding someone who has dual citizenship who's not, because you can't travel with your U.S. passport to Venezuela to travel with these children to bring them back to their mother. So finding someone who's a national of some other country who can even accompany a child on that journey. And that's, again, presuming like that the family decides the best thing is for that kid to go with their mother, which you always want a child to be with their mother, but also not if they can't eat. And like there's really stark decisions to be made here by families. So that's one example. I mean, another, you mentioned Minnesota. One of the dynamics we highlight in the report, and honestly, these are not even accounted for in the numbers that we calculated, because when we did these numbers, we would have said, well, these people are not vulnerable to deportation. But you had refugees who were lawfully resettled, invited by the U.S. government to come and rebuild their lives in the United States, who were detained in Minnesota back in January. And it was part of a process called Operation Paris. It's an acronym, post-admission refugee, something or other, I forget. But honestly, when this started happening and our partners in Minnesota told us this, we think this is happening, we weren't sure we believed them because it's not supposed to be legally possible. But basically, I mean, you had a situation, this has been documented in court, where a Karen Burmese mother, a Christian, which is a lot of the refugees in Minnesota, persecuted for their faith in Burma, was taken from her home, taken from a 5-month-old U.S. citizen baby nursing on her, like as they came upon her. And they left the baby behind and took this mother to Texas. And in that case, at least, and similar cases with refugees, a federal judge intervened and said that shouldn't have happened. They were lawfully present. They were not accused of any criminal offense. And they were sent back eventually to Minnesota. In some cases, they had to find their own way back to Minnesota. The government didn't facilitate that, but they are back now. And under this judge's order, that shouldn't happen again. But it was remarkably upsetting. And again, I have 4 kids. Kids are resilient, but also like there's a lot that can happen when they experience that sort of trauma at a young age. And for it to be done without a compelling public policy reason, I think is really heartbreaking. And this is happening on a scale. I mean, our estimate of this report is there's 910,000 U.S. citizen kids who will be separated from one or both parents during this administration, if the administration proceeds with what it says is its goal, which is 1 million deportations a year. That's a lot of children. And
That's
some
a
of
lot
them
of
will be
kids.
separated from one parent. About 500,000 or more will be separated potentially from both parents. And then you're looking at, is reunification possible in the country of origin? Is it an uncle or an aunt? Is it somebody from a local church who's going to care for this child? Is it the foster care system, which, as you know very well, is maxed out without adding hundreds of thousands of children to it?
Yeah, yeah. It's we when we hear family separation, I'm taken back to the first Trump administration. At the time, there were policies that were in place, the family separation policy, remain in Mexico, some of these other policies that had a tremendous effect on asylum seekers as well as those that are seeking to immigrate. What was mind-boggling to me at the time, I was living and working in East Africa, doing community development type work, specifically within the orphan care space, and aiming to get kids out of orphanages and back into families. That's what I've spent so much of my career doing. And family separation is something that we talked about constantly, because you have kids that are needlessly living on the streets or needlessly living in orphanages where really they could be reunified and supported to live within their family, which is God's design. Now, when those policies started coming out during the first Trump administration, I had never heard so many people talk about family separation. And it was not in the context of orphan care where we were using it, right? And yet that trauma that you were just describing is so prevalent for kids that have their home disrupted, right? And lose the parental care of one or both of their parents. I mean, it is it's so detrimental, to put it lightly. When I think about, oh yeah, go
I was
ahead.
just going to add, I mean, I think that family separation dynamic in 2018 in the first Trump administration was horrific. And I remember at a certain point sort of banging my head up against the wall, like it didn't seem like people cared, but it really was that people didn't realize it. And then at a certain point, it hit the news, and we were well aware of it at World Relief well before that, because we were seeing some of the impacts, and some of our partners were. When people understood what was happening, I think it's a credit, first and foremost, to the American people, and including the majority of evangelical Christians who were polled at the time. People didn't like that policy.
Right.
Really, and then the Trump administration, to their credit, canceled it. Like they pulled back when it was clear that it was not politically popular. Right? And that ultimately affected between 2,000 and 3,000 children, which is horrific. Now we're talking about 900,000 children. And I think that people need to reckon with like the scale that we're looking at right now is actually many times more than what happened in 2018. And part of the reason we've done this report, and the NAE would work with us on this report, is because we think actually that American Christians have not changed their views that God's design is for a child to grow up with their mom and their dad whenever possible. But I do think that a lot of American Christians haven't realized just how commonly this is an effect of a mass deportation policy when you're going after people without criminal convictions.
Right. Yeah. And that's what I was kind of wondering, because when I saw the numbers in the report, the scale just seems like it's just ramped up to the nth degree, which is really hard to wrap your mind around. And going back, kind of juxtaposing the first Trump administration's policy with this current one, the reality is when they ended the first family separation policy and how that had separated so many kids, it was not just we flipped this switch. It's actually, if you're intercepting a family and you want to flip the switch and just send mom one way and send kid other way, that you can do. But you can't just flip it back the other way in terms of like, now we have to trace, where did the mom go? Oh, the mom was deported. Oh, we still have the kid in foster care in some other state, right?
And sometimes you didn't even write down the child's mother's name. Like that's how egregious this was.
And it was, so to undo that was far more complicated than the inverse action that started it, right?
That's right.
So now when I think about what is happening at this scale and that there is determination, right? I mean, that's the value of this report. And that's why we wanted to cover it as well, is because people need to know that this separation is taking place at a whole other level. And I'm not sure. I would be hard pressed to think that it can just be undone. When we looked at the previous family separation policy, which maybe had some differences in terms of how it was implemented, but the effect was the same, right? How do you kind of speak to that in terms of like what would it even look like to reverse course? Not that the administration is saying that they want to reverse course, but what does that even look like?
Yeah, I mean, it is precisely because it is so difficult to reunite a family once they have been separated that I think our largest hope with this report is that we would stop this policy before it proceeds. I mean, it's already in effect, to be clear. Like, we already are seeing the effects of this. But the U.S. has not separated 900,000 children from their parents. Like, that's the projection for, the full 4 years of this administration. Um, it could be stopped. And we also, I mean, I think Congress has an important role in that because we're not saying we'll just ignore that some people have violated a law. Again, some of these people didn't violate a law. They came in lawfully at the invitation of the U.S. government, and our administration made a decision to remove their legal status, and then to pursue family separation as a part of a mass deportation. Others of these people came in unlawfully or overstayed a visa 20 years ago, and we're not saying that's just fine, ignore it, but Congress could pass a penalty for that, like a fine that would, it would affirm that was unlawful, you shouldn't have crossed the border illegally. But since you've been here 20 years and you haven't committed other, violations of law, and taking into account the well-being of your U.S. citizen children or of your U.S. citizen spouse, people, I think, sometimes presume that if you married a U.S. citizen, that solved your legal issues. And it's not that simple. Sometimes there's a process, and sometimes there literally is not. So for Congress to step in and say, hey, there's the penalty for having broken that law, and we're not saying violating a law was good. We are saying there could be more humane alternatives to detaining and deporting literally millions of people, which also, by the way, like, you could have people pay a fine that reduces the federal deficit instead of spending billions of taxpayer dollars to detain and deport people, and then dealing with the other reality that, is not our primary concern at World Relief, but it matters to a lot of Americans. You also then lose those people from their jobs, where they're picking food for American agriculture, they're cleaning hotel rooms, they're a very actually important part of the U.S. economy. And a lot of Americans are concerned right now with inflation, and I deal with that too. Gas prices, those are some other causes for that, but like a lot of the other dynamics, housing and food, are directly related to construction and agriculture, which are sectors of our economy that have historically relied very heavily on immigrant workers. And when they're removed at taxpayer expense, the way that we bear that as an economy is actually beyond just what you pay in taxes to have them removed. It's also when costs go up for, the cost of living.
Yeah, it's very, the inflation. I'm feeling it. I also have 4 kids, and it's
They eat
expensive.
so much, right?
Oh my gosh, especially the 18-year-old. I cannot keep up with this kid. I heard him making something in the kitchen just this morning. I was like, bro, you are emptying just to go to school. You're just emptying the cabinet. One of the things that obviously that you specifically oversee is the policy and advocacy for world relief. I want to ask you something that I asked Heather Taylor last year from Bread for the World, which is, this is the environment. These are the policies that are being handed down. This is what enforcement looks like. My audience knows that I did not vote, would not vote. I'm actually quite Anabaptist. I don't know your political views. I know maybe that's just hip now to be a white guy that doesn't come from the Brethren and be Anabaptist. But I had asked Heather, what does this even look like? Like, advocating in front of an administration that maybe doesn't even want to listen, doesn't like listening to the courts, doesn't really, seek to listen to the legislature. What does it look like to actually advocate before that type? What does that look like for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually that 2018 example of family separation at the border is a good example on this, because to my recollection, it's the only immigration policy of the first Trump administration that they did change course on, and it happened because of advocacy. I was on Capitol Hill in June of 2018 with a bunch of pastors for World Refugee Day, and I just remember being in one office after another, and you would hear the phone just ringing off the hook, and the very nice, usually college student intern answering the phone, and I only could hear one side of the conversation, but they would say things like, oh no, my boss is definitely against tearing mothers from their children. And that was Republicans and Democrats. And to be clear, this was not even a policy that Congress put into place. Like, they didn't pass a law that made this the policy. It was the administration reinterpreting laws that had been on the books for a long time and saying, well, this is what we have to do to enforce the law. But I think in part because it was 2018, it was a midterm congressional year, and some of those members of Congress were facing re-election and worried that it wasn't going to go well, which, by the way, it didn't, for those who were in line with that policy. And a lot of them were calling down the street to the White House and saying, like, this policy is hurting us. I genuinely think if there were those phone calls going into members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, and be really clear, World Relief is not a partisan organization. We're not here to help either side. But if those phone calls were happening at in significant numbers, saying, hey, we want better alternatives than mass deportation for people who have not, been convicted of violent crimes. I actually think that you might see the administration reverse course. You might see Congress sort of take back some of their authority to change policies and make better alternatives. There's a bill that we support at World Relief right now in the Congress called the Dignity Act. It's got a Republican co-sponsor and a Democratic co-sponsor and many other co-sponsors in both parties. It's not a perfect bill, but it would be a much, much better situation for millions of immigrant families. And I think a much better situation for the security of the United States, for the economy of the United States, for Americans, if Congress would, put aside some of their differences and forge a consensus around something that probably both sides would have to give and take a little bit. And then, of course, it would have to actually be signed by President Trump into law for it to go into effect and have it make a difference. But I would hope, President Trump has ran on being he's all about the art of the deal. He could do something that President Bush tried to do and President Obama tried to do and President Biden tried to do and all failed, which is to actually reform our immigration laws, to have a functional, coherent system that values legal immigration, that stops illegal immigration, and that responds to those who are already here in a way that is not an amnesty that ignores the law, but also is not a family-separating, economy-busting mass deportation.
Right. Well, wasn't that part of what was, wasn't under Biden, there was some legislation that was going around that was going to get passed, and Trump kind of put the kibosh on it because he wanted to be the one to pass it. And then here we are. I'm aware of even some of Obama's deportation, practices. And I do kind of feel like, man, because we have not had that wide scale immigration reform, now we're just kind of being, getting whiplash going between something like what Biden was doing, which also did not work. Mm-hmm. And then, now this, which is just so much more overtly violent and, just awful. How would you kind of speak to that? Especially being nonpartisan.
Yeah. I think, part of being nonpartisan is being willing to critique both sides. And I think it's very appropriate in this case.
You should be an Anabaptist then, dude. That's all we do. No.
President Obama did some helpful things in immigration, to be sure. He also deported more people. I think he still got the title. President Trump might take it over, but President Trump never in his first term deported the numbers that President Obama did his first term. And I would say the Obama administration, under a lot of good advocacy and pressure, sort of figured it out by their second term. Like, oh, what if we focused on people who were convicted of violent crimes, which is exactly what the Trump administration says sometimes that they're doing. But if you look at their documents, they've also been pretty clear that actually, no, they've eliminated those prioritifications. They don't have a priority on people who are violent criminals. The priority is numbers. And there's just not enough people convicted of violent crimes to hit those numbers. So they're actually going, in many cases, for the easiest people to find. The people who show up for their court dates seeking asylum. The people who were here lawfully last week with temporary protected status. So you know exactly where they live. And I think, that you also mentioned, this is absolutely true. There was a proposal, and Senator Lankford, a Republican out of Oklahoma, was really critical in this to reform some of the dynamics at the border. Honestly, that bill wouldn't have solved all the immigration issues, but it was, I think, a good faith effort to say, how do we reform how asylum processing works? And President Trump, when he was not president, he was out of office at that moment, basically scuttled that whole process. And he said out loud the part that you're not really supposed to say, which is, we don't want to solve this issue before the elections. We want a chaotic border situation so that it influences how people vote. Now, the border is much quieter, and some of that's a positive thing, of course. We don't want chaos at the border, although I would add, it's also, we've closed off asylum to people with very genuine asylum claims. They just have no options at this point. They're being sent back to situations of danger, which we don't think is acceptable. But honestly, from a political level, if President Trump would have just done what he's done at the border, I would still have my critiques from like a due process, legal
Hmm.
concern and those fleeing persecution. But I think he would be doing really well in the polls on immigration. But he didn't
Hmm.
stop there. He went into communities like Chicagoland, where I live, into Minneapolis, into Memphis, into North Carolina, and detained people, separated families, have shown up in church parking lots in ways that have people afraid to go to church. I mean, I've heard from a lot of friends in Spanish-speaking church contexts that church attendance is way down, and they
Hmm.
have formally said we are undoing previously existing guidance that would say we're not going to do immigration enforcement in church, except for in very unique public safety reason for very unique public safety reasons. And changing that policy has had a profoundly chilling effect on people just showing up on Sunday morning to worship Jesus. None of those are things that actually are playing that well politically, and that shows up in the polling. Uh, but I think it will take more advocacy, more people actually not just complaining, to their friends and family, but making those phone calls to their members of Congress for us to see this actually change in real policy.
Yeah, it's interesting. We work with another agency out here in the Sound that works in refugee resettlement, and I know that they lost some of their funding. I think that's probably pretty inherent in this situation, but it was actually the first thing that this caseworker mentioned to me was that it was. I mean, here in Seattle, Biden's policy was also not working. We had essentially had homeless encampments that were
Yeah,
just made of Venezuelans,
yeah.
kind of thing. And like, so it is, we need that reform. And, I wish that it were taking place. And I'm increasingly disenchanted, but I guess that's the age that we live in, isn't it?
I will tell you, I have been at this 20 years, so obviously I've learned to deal with disappointment from Congress.
Yes.
What encourages me is the way that churches have stepped up in the midst of some of these circumstances. Like the church is literally taking kids into their homes whose
Hmm.
parents have been
Yeah.
deported to Venezuela. The churches who, when the Venezuelans were arriving here in Chicago, very similar to what was happening in Chicago, were stepping up and saying, wow, this is just not a sustainable situation, but what can we do to administer to people in a very stark situation? I actually, I mean, of course, lots of Christians have voted in lots of different ways, and I don't agree with all of them. But I think that if people understand what's happening, and the polling actually shows this as well, like you still have a very strong majority of evangelical Christians, 70%, who think the U.S. has a moral responsibility to receive refugees. Three-quarters of evangelical Christians, according to Lifeway Research, say that they would support policies that would both improve border security and have an earned legalization process with the payment of a fine for people who've overstayed their visas or crossed the border unlawfully and haven't committed other criminal offenses. I think there's actually more common ground there than sometimes people presume. And if we could get Congress to be aware of that, I actually think there's some hope here.
Well, we could use the hope, and I like that. And yes, we have hope in Christ. One of the things that you guys get into this in the report, but it's also in other writings that you have let out in Matthew, which has really been kind of that applied theology, the biblical hermeneutic towards understanding immigration. Before we wrap, I would love if you could even just, how should we as Christians be thinking through this biblically? And what do you think that should entail
Yeah.
towards our political engagement?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. And I mean, in some ways, it's a mistake to just presume that people already are thinking about this biblically, because maybe your podcast listeners, Brandon, are starting that conversation there. But if you look at the church overall, like that same Lifeway Research survey that I just mentioned, which has some really good findings into public policy, it has some fairly dismal findings about how the Bible influences evangelicals' views on immigration. It's less than a quarter of American evangelicals who say the Bible's the top influence on their views. And they're kind of supposed to know that's the right answer. If you're taking a survey and you're an evangelical Christian and one of the check boxes is the Bible, kind of doesn't matter what the question was. That was probably where you should have gone.
I
But
teach Sunday school. That's towards the top. Yeah.
yes, and yet when it comes to immigration, we have been shaped by media, by social media, by partisan politics, by our personal experiences, and those of friends and families. All of which there's a place for all those things, but the scriptures ought to be the starting point. To very quickly summarize, what is a very, there's a lot we could go to in the Bible on this topic, but you have starting with people being made in the image of God. And that's not just like sort of that happens to be Genesis 1, but I think that ought to shape how we think about any category of vulnerable people. So remember both that they have dignity because they're human beings, full stop, regardless of what country they're from, what religion they're from, what language they speak, any other factor. Also that they have potential because they're made in the image of a creator God. And a lot of the debates around immigration start with like, oh, look at how much this is going to cost us. And the interesting thing is economists, whether they're Christians or not, usually think that's wrong. Like, no, actually, you're not taking into account how they're contributing, whether with taxes or with their work or with their consumption. And that shouldn't surprise us as Christians because we believe that God made human beings with this potential to create and to contribute. I think then you have all these very specific instructions from God to his people about caring for the vulnerable. And in the Old Testament, that's often the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. Not that that's an exclusive list, but certainly those are good places to start for us as well. And yeah, we could go through the many instances of that in both in the Old Testament. That theme certainly carries into the New Testament as well. I think another biblical theme is the idea of hospitality. And that's like a kind of church word where we hear it and we think about, oh, that's like the committee of people who make coffee. But it's actually more than that. It's also more than an industry of hotels and restaurants. It's more than having a really nice fancy meal for your friends or washing the sheets and the towels for your in-laws when they're coming into town. Those are nice things to do, but they're actually missing out on hospitality in the true sense of the Greek word, which is philoxenia, which is the love of strangers, which is not an American cultural value. I mean, I grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons that were about stranger danger. Like, strangers are scary people. I recently let my kids watch like the old 1980s, maybe 90s version of DuckTales, which is, you can watch this now.
DuckTales.
I kind of forgot that the theme song starts with the danger, watch behind you. There's a stranger out to find you. Like, no wonder this is our culture. Like, we've been trained in this way. But the biblical message is not that strangers are always safe. I don't think we can make that, sort of, there's not a chapter and verse for that. But we are commanded in Romans 12 to practice hospitality, to practice loving strangers. In 1 Timothy and Titus, this is a requirement for leadership in the church. In Hebrews 13, we're told that some people, by welcoming strangers, have entertained angels without realizing it. Then you could get to the Great Commission, this opportunity to make disciples as people come into this context where we are blessed with religious freedom, where we're free to share our faith and people are free to receive that or to reject it. That's not the context that many of them came from. And then the flip side of that, I think, is that so many of the immigrants coming in are already brothers and sisters in Christ. And I think sometimes American churches miss that. But the places that immigrants are coming from overall are in many cases more Christian by any way you want to measure that than the United States of America is at this point. In fact, a significant share of those people who are coming to the United States they've left their home country because of their faith in Jesus, because they were facing persecution. Like if you look at refugee resettlement, there was 100,000 refugees resettled in 2024, which was a relative high year. We're not going to hit 10% of that most likely this year. But in 2024, 100,000 refugees were resettled. The majority of them are Christians of one tradition or another. The majority of those Christians came from the 50 countries where Open Doors says that Christians face the most severe persecution in the world. So wow. A lot of these are folks fleeing persecution for their Christian faith, which, by the way, when we shut down refugee resettlement, which is largely what's happened right now, we're closing the door on those persecuted believers, along with Muslims and Hindus and others who might have encountered Jesus had they had that opportunity to rebuild their lives here.
Yeah, no, it's a huge opportunity for the church and something that we need to continue to look for opportunities to serve those families. And yeah, you guys are leading the way in so many regards alongside other churches and nonprofits and so forth. And we're just grateful for World Relief. Matthew, I'm grateful for your time and just your expertise in guiding our audience as well. So yeah, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, I'm glad for the opportunity, Brandon. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And for our listeners, may Almighty God, who created us in his own image, grant us grace to fearlessly contend against evil and to make no peace with oppression, that we may reverently use our freedom and employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities and among the nations, to the glory of God's holy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with the Father and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. And we will catch you guys on the next episode of Think Global, Do Justice.